Good evening, everybody. I'm so happy to be here tonight and doing the thing that I love most, and that is talking about community association management. I'm so glad you guys have all been able to join this webinar. It's going to be very informative. This is actually my favorite time of year. It is budget season and annual meeting season, and I just love this time of year. And we're going to be talking about a lot of great things this evening. My name is Jennifer Carter, for those of you who don't know who I am, and I am the Chief Operating Officer here at Ardent Residential, as well as a qualifying broker. I have been doing community association management in Georgia for over 20 years. This webinar is really focused on community associations as it relates to annual meetings specifically. And we'll be talking a little bit about both the difference of having a virtual meeting versus an in-person annual meeting. You know, COVID-19 has changed the way community associations hold meetings, not just annual meetings, but just even general meetings. Never would I have imagined when I first started doing this 20 years ago that I would be doing virtual meetings, doing meetings virtually. I mean, it just blows my mind away. But I think this is the future. So without further ado, I'm going to share my screen and we're going to get started and talk about our agenda. There we go. Okay, so the first thing I want to point out is, you know, I essentially want to point out a disclaimer here. You know, today's webinar is for educational purposes only, and this should not be considered as legal advice or counsel. Every community is going to be a little bit different based on your governing documents. So you should review your governing documents for more specific detail related to your association, or consult with your association manager or association's attorney directly if you have any questions. Okay, everybody is on mute, so just so you guys know, but I encourage you guys as we go through this webinar to put any questions that you guys might have in the chat, and we will get to all of those questions at the end, time permitting. Okay, so here's the agenda. Here are the things that I really want to cover as we go through this webinar. I'm going to talk to you guys a little bit about some annual meeting vocabulary. I think that's always important to define some of the words that we're going to be using. We're going to talk about virtual annual meetings, of course, and in conjunction with the difference between that and actual in-person annual meetings. We'll be talking about some tips for productive meetings and meeting etiquette. We'll touch on electronic voting, and then I'm going to talk to you guys about how you really calculate quorum. You know, there's a lot of misconceptions when it comes to annual meetings and calculating quorum, and you know, after what happens after an election. So make sure you guys put your questions in the chat as you think of them, so we can circle back around to that once we get to the end of this presentation. Okay, so the first thing we're going to talk about is vocabulary. The vocabulary words that I'm going to be using. So you hear a lot of people talk about governing documents. You might hear them be called covenants or CCRs, which CCRs essentially stand for covenants, conditions, and restrictions. You hear the word bylaws. Any of these words are essentially what's considered the instruments that govern the association, okay? Provisions, you hear that word a lot, right? A provision is a specific section in your governing documents that speak to a particular subject matter for your association. So if I want to talk about your annual meeting and your annual meeting requirements, I'm going to go to your bylaws and go to that specific provision in your governing documents to see what it says. Because remember, every association is a little bit different. Okay, everybody has a little bit different provisions. Everybody has a different quorum amount. They have different meeting notice requirements. Let's talk about that. What's a quorum? Okay, a quorum is a percentage, usually a percentage or a number that must be present in order to either be present in person or by proxy in order to take any action at a meeting, okay? If you don't have quorum at a meeting, you cannot take any action. There cannot be a vote. So that's why quorum is important. And again, it's usually based on a percentage, okay? An example, you may see your governing documents, your bylaws may talk about your quorum being 25%. That means 25% of people in person, eligible people in person or by proxy, must be present in order to take action. And for the purposes of this meeting, the action we're really talking about is voting in new board members to the association. Meeting notice requirements, that's going to be different per the bylaws, per the governing instruments for your association. That basically says, how much notice do I have to give my membership to make it legal, right? To make it legally sound, right? And there's usually a time in which you have to send notice out by, right? There's a deadline. You have to get that notice out by that date. And there's also, it usually speaks to, you can't send notice too far in advance. Like if I want to have a meeting January 30th, it's more than likely too soon for me to send that official notice out in the month of September. So again, that's what meeting notice requirements are. Robert's Rule of Order. Okay, I think that this is something that a lot of people can be educated about. And I think, in fact, my next webinar may be on Robert's Rule of Order. I've been kind of thinking about that. But it's a guide for conducting meetings and making decisions as a group. I've seen so many boards not use this format at their meeting, and it really makes for messy meetings. So I'm going to actually show you guys a little document that I have here. And I'm going to have this sent out to everybody that's attending this meeting. I'm going to have this sent out to everybody. It basically is a little cheat sheet on how you use Robert's Rule of Order, right? And again, you wouldn't be using Robert's Rule of Order if there wasn't a quorum. So I'm going to send this out in a email, a blast that will go out to everybody that registered for this event. Okay, let's get back to my slides here. Let's talk about virtual meetings, okay? Let's do it. Can we do it? Should we do it? What about our bylaws? How do we serve notice? Can we vote? How do we vote? And is a virtual meeting really a meeting, right? So we're gonna take a deep dive into that and really talk about that. But first, I want this, if you all don't get anything else out of this webinar tonight, it must be this. You cannot, and I'm going to repeat myself, you cannot establish quorum virtually. Okay, that is really the ultimate difference between a virtual meeting versus an in-person meeting. And let's talk about why you can't. Okay, you can't establish quorum virtually for many reasons. Number one, I'm sure a lot of you have probably joined virtual meetings and you have people with different screen names and they don't know how to change their screen name. It could be their kids' Fortnite username that they use. You could have multiple people from one household joining a virtual meeting. I know that when my community had their meeting last year, I joined from my office on my computer and my husband joined from home. And it just starts to get too messy. We also can't give a written ballot at that time, right? It's very difficult to do. So there's a lot of reasons why you can't establish quorum, and you just can't do it. So, we're going to talk about the virtual meeting format, and we're going to talk a little bit about what do we do to have our election if we're having our meeting virtually, but we can't take action because we can't establish quorum. And that's what you need to remember about a virtual meeting. Because you cannot establish quorum, you cannot take any action. Okay, I'm gonna give you guys a trick question at the end, okay? But you can't establish quorum, you can't take any action. So you can't have an election and you can't vote on any other matters at that meeting as well, okay? So, essentially the virtual meeting essentially becomes a, I'm gonna go back to my screen so I can see everybody. You can't establish the quorum, but you're going to have a meeting. You have to have an annual meeting, okay? But if you're doing it virtually, it essentially becomes a town hall meeting. It just becomes a glorified town hall meeting. That's all the meeting is. The board should be meeting with their manager about a week or so before the annual meeting to really talk about the expectations of the meeting and how the meeting's going to be ran, okay? The board is ultimately responsible for running that annual meeting. Okay, the managers should come on. The managers should introduce themselves. They should introduce the board, and they should talk about the expectations of the meeting. Okay, one thing we learned in 2020 is that chat menu got really hot and heavy, okay, because everybody is muted. You can't have a virtual meeting with 70 people that are unmuted. Okay, there's too much background noise. You got people driving in their car. You got kids screaming in the background. It's just too much. So we, at least at Ardent Residential, we use a Zoom platform, and our policy is to mute everybody. And we ask everybody to please put their questions in the chat, and we monitor all of the questions so that we can get to everybody's questions. It's just not possible to unmute everybody. We do let everybody know at the beginning of the meeting that we do expect everybody to be respectful and courteous. Okay, this is a professional meeting of the association, which is a business. And we ask everybody to conduct themselves in a professional and respectful manner, and to remember board members are volunteers. So we started to see very early on, the first handful of virtual meetings we started doing, was that people were using that chat menu, and they were becoming very aggressive and saying some very, very nasty and mean things about people. And we had to start removing them, because that's disorderly conduct. Again, when you guys read the Robert's Rule of Order cheat sheet that I'm going to send over to you, that's disorderly conduct. And you can remove people from a meeting if they're interrupting the business of the meeting. Why do a virtual meeting? Okay, so you might be asking yourselves at this point, why would we even do a virtual meeting? Well, we are still in an active pandemic. Okay, we've got all kinds of variants coming out now. We're going into flu season. Not everybody's vaccinated. And so we are still in a pandemic. And it is still advisable at this point, due to that communities hold as many of their meetings virtually as they can for the safety of the community. Now, does that mean that there are a lot of communities out there that are very small? There are a lot of people out there that have boards that have smaller boards, and they may meet with an owner one-off at the clubhouse if the owner wants to participate in the meeting. And that's fine. The board can do that. You're not at that point, as long as you're social distancing and people wearing masks, I mean, you're fine. But we're talking about bringing a group of 20, 30, 40, 50 people together. It's recommended that you do it virtually. Now, that doesn't mean that everyone's going to. It's really what the board decides. And there really isn't essentially a wrong or a right way to hold the meeting. But the other benefit of doing these meetings virtually is the convenience of membership being able to attend from any location. And what we actually found last year was that we had higher meeting attendance. We had higher involvement. We had more people wanting to get involved because they were able to attend the meeting virtually. Let's say they were still at work and they couldn't get off in time to make the meeting, or maybe they're traveling, or maybe they're stuck at home with kids that are sick, so it just made it much more convenient for the membership to be a part of those meetings and still get the information and still participate virtually versus having to do it in person. I can't tell you how many meetings I've been to over the 20 years that I've been doing this, and I'll show up at an annual meeting and it will be the board and me and maybe 2 or 3 homeowners, of a community of 100 unit owners. So it was really nice to see a lot of involvement last year with the virtual meeting option. Okay, so I guess the next I think question you might be asking yourself is, if you're going to do your meeting virtually, how do we hold an election? Okay, because we can't establish quorum and we can't take any action. So how do we have our election? How do we vote in new members of the board? And again, there's really going to be 2 options for that. There's an electronic voting option. Okay, you can only do electronic voting, however, if your governing documents have provisions that state electronic voting is allowed. You more so now you see that in newer developed communities. A lot of older communities do not have that provision, so they cannot do electronic voting. I've seen a lot of associations this last year try to pass amendments to have electronic voting as an option for the association, because that That obviously is very ideal, the electronic voting option. But if your governing documents don't have a provision that talk to the specifics of the association being able to electronic vote, you can't. So what do we do? At the annual meeting, the manager again introduces themselves, the board, they set the expectations, and then the board will go through their presentation. They'll do a financial report. They'll talk about projects that got completed last year. They'll talk about upcoming projects. They'll talk about the budget. They'll take Q&A from the membership. But we will also do, in lieu of an election, we will open up nominations from the floor. Now, when we send our meeting notice out to the membership and we send that out to them, we always send out a nomination form. We're always looking for new people to run for the board. And when we get the nomination forms back, naturally, those people would go on the ballot. Now, when you go to an in-person meeting and you have a quorum, you establish quorum at your in-person meeting, you will have an election. Okay, but there's always an opportunity for people to nominate themselves from the floor before the actual election happens. So they'll be added to the ballot at that time. So what we're doing in lieu of an election during the virtual annual meeting option is we're actually asking anybody at that time if they want to be included on the ballot. And if they didn't turn a nomination form in. And we'll ask everybody who is wanting to serve on the board to maybe speak for 1 to 2 minutes. And essentially at that point, we will end the meeting. The next day, the very next business day, the manager will send out ballot to the membership with everybody who wants to be on the board. And the ballot is it's very specific, and it talks to the membership about why we're doing a mail-in ballot method, and how we actually can establish quorum by having that election is we need that number of people. We need a certain number of people to turn their ballots in to have that election. Okay. Let's say your quorum number is 32. You need 32 people to make a quorum in person, 32 people in person or by proxy. If you have that, you can have the election at the in-person meeting. Virtually, you have to have 32 people turn in a ballot by the deadline. We typically give about 30 days for everybody to turn the ballots in. And they can turn the ballots in a number of ways. They can turn it in electronically, they can mail it in, they can fax it in, they can submit it through our portal. So there's a lot of different options for owners to turn their ballots in. So again, if we get 32 ballots back, if 32 is our quorum number and we get 32 ballots back, then we have an election. So the manager, along with somebody else who will certify the results with the manager, will actually count the ballots together, and they will announce the election results to the community. Okay. Instead of doing it at the annual meeting, they're just doing it after they've received all the ballots and they've counted them. Okay. I think the two biggest differences between the virtual meeting and the actual in-person meeting is obviously you're doing in person, you're going to be in person, you're going to see people in person versus virtually. If quorum is established at the in-person meeting, an election can occur right then and there. I think that's the biggest difference between an in-person and a virtual meeting. And if you don't have a quorum at the in-person meeting, you won't have another election until such a time when another special meeting is called to do a vote or something, or the next annual meeting. And in those cases, just so you guys know, if there's not a quorum that's established either by mail-in ballot or in person, the board rolls over for another year. They roll over until either the next annual meeting or they roll over until another special meeting is called. So that essentially is how that works. You have a lot of boards who, a lot of communities with a lot of homes, it's very hard for them to get quorum, and the boards essentially roll over and roll over and roll over. And the only way for a board member to get off the board is to resign, and then the board will fill that vacancy until the next annual meeting. So that's how that works. Okay. The final thing I really want to end with before we go into a Q&A is really talking about how you calculate quorum, correctly. Okay. A lot of people have a misconception that, if my community association has 100 unit owners or lot owners, and the quorum per my bylaws is 25%, Well, if you take 25% 100, that's 25. So a lot of people think that 25 is a quorum number. If your governing document provisions state, and most of the time they do, that only eligible voters can vote in the election, then you have to take out the number of delinquencies. So I'm going to kind of show you guys a calculation here. So you take the total unit number, total lot owners, 100. You take your quorum number, 25%. And let's say you have 10 people that are delinquent per your bylaws and they cannot vote. You essentially take your 100 owners, you minus 10 from that number, which gives you 90. Okay, everybody's following me, I hope. You have 90 eligible voters. You're going to take your 25% quorum based off that 90 number, which is really 23. So when an association has a lot of delinquencies, I always tell the boards this: if you have a lot of delinquencies, now's the time to do those, to get those amendments passed, because it's easier. You don't have as many ballots that you have to collect. So having high delinquencies in a situation where an association is trying to get amendments passed can work in their benefit, especially if it's a very large association and the quorum number is high. Okay. I'm excited to see what kind of questions you guys have. Share them with me or raise your hand and I can unmute you and we can even have conversation. I don't see anything in the chat right now. Trying to see if anybody has their hands raised. Hi. Oh, shoot. Let's see. Thought I saw somebody's hand up. Hi, Sharon. How are you doing?
Oh, thanks. How about you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. What kind of question do you have?
Can you just quickly go review again about the slide about how meetings are held, the two options that you mentioned? Can you just do that? Repeat those for me again, please.
So you have two options to hold an annual meeting. You have your in-person option and your virtual option.
Yeah, that's fine. You talked about the part about the ballot.
Oh, okay. So if you're having a virtual meeting, you can't have the election at the virtual meeting. So okay. The next day, the very next business day after the meeting's held, and after you've allowed people to nominate themselves at that virtual town hall, again, I call it a glorified town hall meeting. Okay. You allow people to nominate themselves. You know, the manager will come on and say, all right, guys, so we're going to be wrapping up the meeting. But before we do, we really want to hear from anybody that wants to possibly serve on the board. If you didn't get your nomination form in, if you just forgot, or now you're thinking you may want to actually serve on the board of directors, now's your time to let us know. And they'll typically put in the chat menu, hey, I want to serve on the board. And once we get all the nominations at that point, we will then ask if anybody wants to introduce themselves to the membership while they're all on the call, right? Tell them a little bit about yourself. And then the very next day, the manager is going to actually mail the ballot out to the membership. The ballot will explain exactly why we're doing the ballot, mail-in ballot option. And it will tell everybody how many ballots, based on the percentage or number in your bylaws that you have to have back in order to have the election. But we typically give about 30 days for people to return that ballot. And we tell everybody, don't vote for more than so many people, okay? That's another thing I see a lot of. The ballot specifically says if there's 2 positions open and there's 4 people running, if you vote for more than 2 people, you vote for 3 people or 4 people that are on that ballot, your ballot gets discarded. It doesn't count. So you have to only vote for 2 people if there's only 2 positions open and there's more than 2 people running. But we mail the ballot out and everybody returns it. We collect all of them. They're all saved in a very special place. And once the deadline comes and passes, the manager is going to go through all of the ballots along with another Ardent representative to certify the results, meaning they're going to go through and tally up all the votes, and then they're going to announce the results to the membership. With an in-person meeting, if you have quorum at the meeting, let's say your quorum number is, like I said, 32, and 32 people in person or by proxy attend that annual meeting, you have quorum, which means you can have an election. and you do it right then and there. The ballots are handed out right there at the annual meeting. The people that are on the ballot will get up and speak to everybody that's there, and then everybody will vote for their people they want to vote for, and the manager will go around and collect them at the meeting, and they'll certify those results right there and then at the meeting, and they are able to announce those results in person. But it's sometimes it's very hard to get a quorum in person, especially if you live in a larger community.
Okay. What do you do when you do that process, but you only get, no one responds, only one person volunteered and no one responds in terms of the vote? When the manager sends out the ballots, she gets no response.
And that happens too.
Yeah, that happened to us. So do we just appoint that person to the board, the other board members? What's the protocol?
So if you don't get enough ballots back and it's radio silent from the membership, and again, that's nothing to be alarmed of. That's very common, unfortunately, just like attending the actual annual meeting.
Right.
It's very common. The board, because you don't have an election, because you couldn't establish quorum, you couldn't take that action and have that election, the board is going to roll over to the next year or to the next meeting, the next special meeting, where somebody may call a special meeting to elect new board members. But more often times than not, they're rolling over to the next annual meeting. If somebody wants to come off the board and they no longer want to be on the board, they need to officially resign, and the board needs to fill that vacancy. And I do want to say this for any board members out there, okay, anybody who's joining that's a board member, you cannot just up and leave your board with one board member, okay? If you only have 2 people on your board and you want to resign, you cannot just resign and leave that person alone to manage to be making all the decisions, because you don't have quorum for your board meetings. You don't have enough people to vote on action. So you have every board member, I want to make this very clear, every board member has a fiduciary responsibility to make sure that they're not leaving the association in a bad place. And not having enough board members to vote on things, to conduct business, is leaving the association in a bad place.
Yeah.
So, you know, the board members they do have a duty and a responsibility, a fiduciary responsibility to do the right thing. And so when those situations happen, it's a lot easier when you have 5 board members and 1 resigns and you're left with 4. It's a lot easier because you still have 4 board members, and those 4 board members can usually easily appoint somebody else. But when you get down to like 2, 3 members, it gets really tricky. So, you know, I always advise everybody, listen, just help us find somebody before you go. We really, you know, we need you still. I can't do this alone. You know, we've got to have somebody else.
Okay, good. Thank you. That's good to know, because I didn't know that, because we were left high and dry. So
yeah, I've seen that happen more often times than not. And that's why every time it happens, I call those board members up and I'm like, you can't do it. I'm sorry.
Oh, okay.
You can't do it.
Good to know.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you.
You're welcome. All right, let's see. I've got Ricky. If you own more than 1 home in your community, do you have more than 1 vote? You have as many votes as many lots that you own. Okay, so if you have 4 properties, you have 4 different units or 4 different lots, you have 4 votes. So you get a vote for each one of the lots that you own. That's why a lot of associations, condo questionnaires, especially in condominiums, one of the questions on a condo questionnaire is there one entity that owns, you know, 50% more of the ownership, 50% more, 50% or more of the units in the community. So, you know, it's a question that lenders want to know. You know, they don't necessarily want to fund a loan for a community that's basically one person has all the power because they own most of the units in the community. I see I hope I'm pronouncing this right. Tamir? Did I unmute you? All right, Tamir, I just asked you to unmute. If you're not unmuting, you have to I think you have to unmute yourself. Oh, there you go. Can you hear me? Hello? All right, I'll come back to you, or if you want to put your question in the chat. Let's see, the next question I have is, can you do business at a virtual special assessment meeting? No, again, if you can't establish quorum, you can talk about business. Okay, you can provide updates, you can review financials, you can review budgets, you can have discussions at a meeting, at a virtual meeting. You just can't take any action and vote on something. Okay, so if the association is trying to pass a special assessment and they have a meeting about it virtually, they can then send out the ballots the next day to vote on the special assessment. So typically special assessments are done by ballot anyways, special assessment ballots, but they're typically, I've never seen a special assessment pass at a virtual meeting. Yes, I'm going to forward the cheat sheet on Robert's Rule of Orders. I'm going to make sure that gets out to in an e-blast to everybody that attended and everybody that attended that didn't get, that weren't able to attend tonight. What happens when there's no more board members? Well, that kind of goes back to the question I was just talking about with Sharon, is that, again, the board members have a fiduciary responsibility to fill their vacancy and make sure that they're not leaving the association in a bad place. If you get to the point where there are no board members, literally no board members, then an attorney has to take over the decision making for the association, and that can get very expensive. So I would not recommend that. And that's the conversations that we have with our board clients that, you know, are wanting to resign and they just don't want to be on the board anymore, because let's face it, it's not an easy job. You know, it's a thankless job. People don't appreciate the time and effort you put into this role. You all have, board members have, you know, their own jobs, their own careers, their own families, their own, you know, personal issues going on. And yet they take time out of their own free time to serve on the board for the community that you live in. So, you know, and unfortunately, people can just be really mean and nasty, and they don't understand. For me, it always comes down to an owner typically not understanding the process or not understanding the policy or whatever it might be. Okay. What happens when nobody wants to run for the board? Same thing. If there's nobody on the board and everybody resigns and nobody wants to step up to the plate, the association's attorney has to step in to be that decision maker on behalf of the association. So again, that can get very expensive. We don't want to put ourselves in that situation. If a homeowner is delinquent, Marissa's got a question. If a homeowner is delinquent, I know they can't vote, but they are allowed to speak and raise hands at meetings. Yeah, I mean, just because somebody's delinquent doesn't mean they can't come to the meeting. It doesn't happen very often, believe it or not. It's only happened to me a couple of times throughout my career where I've seen a delinquent owner actually show up for a meeting, but it can happen. We have a way, at least here at Ardent, we have a way to identify those people that attend, that when they come to sign in, when they come to the meeting, the in-person meeting, and they come to sign in, we have a way, we have a secret power that we know when that person signs in, we know that they're there. So we don't typically, we will actually let them have a ballot, because we're not going to have a discussion with them right then and there in front of everybody else about their balance. That's not the purpose of an annual meeting. You know, and that's another thing. That's part of the expectation setting that the manager would do at the very beginning of the meeting, to let everybody know that this isn't the time or forum to bring up questions about your account or questions about a violation letter you received or an update on your work order. This is a community-wide meeting to talk about the business of the association, but we're more than happy to make sure we get your information and we get we get somebody to respond to you, the next business day. But they can participate in the meetings. They can come and they can talk, and they can ask questions. We will give them a ballot to fill out, but when we get that back, we discard it. Again, there's no reason to have contention and have somebody upset at the meeting. We don't ask them to leave, but again, we have a way of knowing who's there that's delinquent, that is going to be turning in a ballot. That's the very first thing we do. People could turn ballots in that are delinquent when we do the mail-in ballot system for the virtual meeting option. We check all of those owners before we calculate the ballots to make sure they're not delinquent. If they're delinquent, their ballot gets discarded. At an in-person meeting, how is the election held? So again, we have to establish quorum. We have to establish quorum in order to have the election. Okay, I can't stress that enough. Once we've established the quorum, the election typically happens after the business of the meeting. And the manager, at least at Ardent Residential, the manager will actually facilitate the election part of the meeting. And we'll get up in front of everybody, and I love doing this. I love it. I love getting up in front of people and talking, and it's just what I love doing. But get up in front of everybody, and you will announce who has turned in a nomination form and who's been included on the ballot at that time. We'll then open the nominations from the floor. Okay, we'll open nominations to the floor, and we will ask 3 times, because that's what Robert's Rule of Order says. You ask 3 times if anybody wants to nominate themselves from the floor. It's like going once, going twice, sold, you know? And you usually the first time, nobody raises their hand. You might get a taker at the second time that you ask. By the third time, usually you'll get somebody, and maybe more than one person. Anybody at that point that has raised their hands and has wanted to nominate themselves from the floor, we have everybody include their name on the ballot. We will then ask everybody that's on the ballot to stand up and introduce themselves to the membership, maybe tell them a little bit about themselves, tell them a little bit about why they're qualified, usually no more than 2 minutes. This isn't, you know, presidential election or anything like that. So they'll speak for a minute or 2 and introduce themselves to the community, to the people that are there. And everybody will then vote for how many positions are open. Again, we make it very clear. If there are 2 positions open, and there are 4 people on the ballot, you vote for 2 people. You don't vote for 3, you don't vote for 4. So everybody will vote. It usually only takes a few minutes. The manager will go around and collect all of the ballots. We will then go usually into the back of the room and start tallying up the votes. Before we start tallying up the votes, we discard anybody that is delinquent that has voted. We discard their ballots. We'll pull out anybody that's a proxy holder. So we'll want to make sure we account for anybody that might have a proxy. You might have the president there and they've got 8 proxy, they're the proxy holder for 8 people. That means that president gets 8 votes plus their vote. So we pull those out next, and then we start tallying up the results. We do that during the Q&A portion of the meeting when the board's asking questions. We'll then go and announce the results to the membership. We will always have somebody with us to tally up the votes, by the way. That's the only way to really certify the results. Somebody at the meeting, the membership meeting, somebody who's not running on the board and not related to somebody running on the board will come and tally up and watch the manager tally up the votes to solidify the results. So we know that there wasn't anything funny going on. Okay, let's see. Let me see who's, I got John here. I'm going to press allow to talk, and then you have to unmute yourself. John, did you get it?
Yeah. Can you hear me?
Hey, John. Good evening. How are you?
Good. How you been?
Great. Great to hear from you.
Yeah, nice to see you. Just a general question. I thought back in 2020, which they may have expired by now, the governor signed some executive orders that allowed virtual HOA meetings and even voting. Do you know if they've expired, or they still in effect, or that way you could get a quorum virtually?
That's a good question. Honestly, I don't know the answer to that, but I will definitely make sure I get that out to you guys after I research that.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, great question though. All right, I'm going through the list. Tamara, were you able to unmute? Okay, let's see. How does one find out each board member duty, what the board member duties are? So essentially that's going to be typically, hopefully your association has bylaws. It's actually not required for every association to have bylaws in Georgia. So, but most associations do have bylaws. And the duties are outlined in the bylaws. It specifically talks about the role of the president, the role of the secretary, the role of the treasurer. And I think it's important to add here that just because you have a president or a secretary, treasurer, every board director that has a voting power does not have more voting power than another member. Just because you're the president, it doesn't give you more power or authority on the board. The president essentially is responsible for running the meeting. We've actually got a great blog coming out that will be posted to our website very soon. I think, JP, correct me if I'm wrong, it might be in this Friday's blog that's going out on the different board member roles. And it really gives a good synopsis of each member's role, the duty and responsibility of that member. But just remember, one board member's position does not have more power over another position. Which board positions are compensated for their positions? Board members should not be compensated for their duties. This is a volunteer role, so they should not be compensated. Although I do know of some associations that will offer a discount on their assessments, and on their assessments that are paid. And again, that's at the discretion of the association and the board. Okay, but board members should not be compensated for their services. Can a board member be removed for their position without being voted out? Well, you have to check your governing documents provisions, because everybody's provisions on board member removal are a little bit different. But if you look in your bylaws, there's an actual section that says removal of board members, and it will talk about the different ways board members can actually be removed. How many times can a board can postpone an annual meeting? Boards really have the authority to do that. Well, it depends. Again, I'm going to go back to saying what depends on what your governing documents state. There are some governing documents that will tell you specifically in the bylaws when that annual meeting must happen. Meaning it could literally say, and I had a community one time that I managed, and it said it must occur on the second Friday in September every year at 8 p.m. I thought, I have to go to an annual meeting at 8 o'clock on a Friday. I said, oh no, we got to get an amendment done, because their bylaws specifically stated the time, the date. We had to have that meeting on Friday, the second Friday of every year, second Friday of September, every year at 8 p.m. Other governing documents, more often than not, you see where the board can determine the date, time, location of the meeting. It can be any time of the year. So if they have that provision, they can postpone the meeting. Although it's good business practice to have an annual meeting once a year. Now with COVID, that's made things a little bit tricky, because we've had a lot of boards try to figure out different ways to hold the in-person meetings. I've seen some communities that require a positive COVID test to attend the meeting. I've seen them do temperature checks. You know, I think everybody's just trying to get creative and do things a little bit differently. And they're really wanting to have that in-person meeting, but they want to do it safely. So when they're doing that, sometimes postponing can be inevitable, and sometimes out of the board's control as well. Can motions be passed at a Zoom regular meeting? Well, no, you shouldn't have any motions being passed. The only time you would actually motion for something, like I motion we move forward with the election, or I motion to move forward that we vote in this new landscaper, you know, whatever it is, you make a motion to take action. When you make a motion, you would have somebody second, and then you would have a vote. So you can't make a motion if you can't establish quorum virtually, okay? What is Ardent's responsibility to make sure the elections are done, even though the annual meetings are delayed continuously? Again, I don't know if I can get to the specifics of answering that question without really understanding that community's governing documents. But I'd be happy to take a look into that. Again, if you guys have other questions that come up, you can always email our support team, HOA support at myardent.com. That's HOA support at myardent.com. You know, again, we want to make sure that we are running the association per the governing documents. Okay. However, the board of directors can make decisions against our recommendations. Okay. So sometimes, and sometimes we will have boards that will do things that, that are against our recommendations. Not always, but yes, I mean, our goal is to always follow the governing documents, to always follow those governing instruments. But again, sometimes there's a lot of variables that are at play, right? There's a lot of things that could be going on that could be delaying things from happening in a quicker turnaround. But again, we're always going to push to make sure that the governing documents are being followed. Okay, let's see. Do we have anybody else's hands raised? Let's see. I'm thinking I got through all the questions this evening so far. It is important for us to know about the governor's executive order on virtual meetings. When will you have an answer? I would hope to have an answer by tomorrow, but give me till Friday, Monday, the latest. And when we send out that e-blast to everybody with the Robert's Rule of Orders, thanking you guys for attending. We'll make sure that we include that Robert's Rule of Orders as well as the governor's executive orders on virtual meetings. That's something that I want to actually talk to one of the attorneys that we work with and talk to him about directly. So it just depends on how quick I can get him on the phone to talk to him about that. Okay. All right. Well, I think we've gotten to everybody's questions here. That has been a pleasure this evening. We will be posting a recording of this video to our website. And I'm really appreciative for everybody being on here tonight. I hope you guys enjoy this beautiful weather that we're about to have here. If you're in Atlanta, at least I'm in Atlanta. So if you're here in the Atlanta area, the weather's supposed to be absolutely gorgeous. And I thank you guys all for being a part of this meeting and participating. I hope everybody has a great night and a great weekend ahead.